Good morning. Thank you all for coming today. I'm Bill Comer. I'm at Portland State University, and my co-author and co-presenter today.
Is Lynn DeBenedette from Brown University.
And we're going to try to address some of the issues that came up after we developed and published our online textbook, Между нами. And we hope that our experience can be of some use to you all. It sounds like some of the issues that we were dealing with are now well known. It really was a whole new world of issues after we published the OER that we as academic and authors hadn't really thought about because they're often the purview of traditional publishers. And there we go. And first, to explain a little bit as to what our OER is. It's called Между нами, or Between You and Me. It's an introductory Russian textbook. And we started this project back in 2012. We knew we wanted to write a new beginning level Russian textbook. We also wanted to write one that would be able to be online to take advantage of the multimedia nature of the web. And also avoid some restrictions that we thought a traditional publisher would probably put on us. So in 2012, we started by writing a table of contents for the OER. What would our language input be? What vocabulary blocks would go with that input? What language output would we expect from learners? And therefore, what kind of grammar structures did we need to teach so that students could use the vocabulary for those output tasks? We didn't really have a way of thinking about what the website would look like. That probably took about 6 to 8 months into this project to come up with something that looks like what you now see on the screen as our opening splash page. And although it took us a while to kind of conceptualize how to put this together, we did share at least a common vision of pedagogy, and that really helped us. We wanted something that was input rich, that was going to have a storyline that continued, and that we would use that storyline to help students learn the language. And we also realized pretty early on that we needed to develop this in a partnership. And so we invited Alice Muslova from Columbia University to join us, and also John Perkins and others at the Academic Resource Center at KU to help us create this site and continue it.
So right here you can see the screen for a typical episode of the storyline, and that those texts are what students progress through as they're reading and listening to the story, and you can see the listening link right there. So an episode has a text, sometimes monologic, sometimes dialogic. It has comprehension work, which is that second menu item on the left, and related grammar explanation, or as it says on the left, a little bit about language. And all of these things, we'll show you the cycle of instruction in a minute. All of this is supported by a lot of visual and audio input that's immediately accessible to the students when they open the text. This is called this is the building where Zoya Stepanovna lives. And the text plots were meant to create a compelling storyline that would hold the students' interests, especially in the 4 US characters and their Russian friends, homestay hosts, teachers, through the course of the academic year that they spend abroad in the 4 different cities, none of which are Moscow, but they fly into Moscow and visit it. And this also allowed us to embed a lot of culture, small c or bigger C culture, right into the texts and the experiences of the students, and make the culture learning work more in harmony with the language learning goals rather than having separate culture bubbles. Bill.
The website also has an extensive online set of comprehension checks so that the learners can check themselves that they got the content information from the episodes correct. And it also allows the learners an opportunity to start working on learning new vocabulary. And the online exercises include audio and visual prompts that are kind of self-correcting on the website.
Here you can see a slide introducing and explaining new grammar points. Sometimes this information is more grammar oriented, sometimes it's lexically oriented as well. And lower down on the same page, you would see several auto checking exercises that help the student ascertain whether they've comprehended the concept, whether they've got it or not. On you go.
Um, One of the kind of fundamental things in writing the book that really helped us do it was developing this kind of scope and sequence work of how we were going to put it together, what kinds of themes and language functions we wanted, how would the vocabulary to support those come up, what grammar would be needed, and then kind of what cultural content we would put in. And so we really tried to organize this and order this across 76 different episodes, right? So this actually wound up being an enormous project, way larger than I think what we knew at the beginning. And it tries to cover whatever that, introductory language course is supposed to cover.
So as we got closer to piloting the book for the first time, which was in the fall of 2013, we realized that we would actually need to hold somewhere, keep somewhere the set of materials that would be used in class. Since we now had developed a vision of the website that would see it more properly used as an out of class resource with occasional use in class for referring to things or previewing the texts, for example. So this is the moment when our workload as OER authors just ballooned because we needed to create the classroom interventions so that we could have a flipped classroom where students would be working on the new language input and reading and listening to information about the language outside of class, checking comprehension outside of class. So we needed not just writing a textbook, but also scripting all the materials for classroom instruction and for homework. So these were written as Word docs, these four workbooks that you can see on the screen. And then they were formatted as PDFs that could be printed on demand or purchased through KU's in-house publisher, Jayhawk Inc. The cost is about the same as it would be for a student to print out copies at a university printing cluster. So they started out, I think, about $12.50 for each volume, and now they're up to about $20 each. So in a semester, a student might choose not to spend the money and print instead, or they might choose to some of them bring them now on tablets that are right they write on the tablets. So that's a thing that the pandemic in our university at least greatly expanded the number of students who have write on tablets and are using the materials that way, so they are not paying for them at all. You might see a contradiction between having an OER and actual print materials for purchase. But students, as I said, can get these materials on their own, and many of them do. But we needed students to be able to write in the classroom for various pedagogical purposes. We needed InfoGap activities to have some element of accountability. We have, of course, a different alphabet, and we have students who need to learn to spell, take notes, make Russian letters, and write efficiently. Bill?
Um, and this slide will give you a little sense of how we conceptualized working with these pieces of the Между нами program. So the online materials here are in black, right? So we start with an episode, there are online comprehension checks, right? Using the website as that textbook in a flipped classroom model, so that the classroom activities, right, which are a separate book that has those red covers, we do those in class. They start mostly with lexical work and then noticing grammar. We send them home to do that more grammar work and reading the grammar explanations on their own. Then there are more classroom activities to work from comprehension to production. And then there are homework activities for written homework, and increasingly thinking about ways of using self-recording to have students audio submit their homework. And so these, kind of cycles can take 1 to 2 days, depending on the kind of length of material, sometimes up to 3. but it gives you an idea of how we're cycling among these three different components of the book.
So once we had created this material and written classroom materials, and along with that, tests and other ancillary things that help the teacher use the classroom materials, there was still the question of how we were going to share this with others. We had about 5 universities piloting the book in the first year. It's now up to about 50 or over that, slightly using the book as a regular textbook. And so this became a very big question for us quickly. Um, these were all materials we were ready to share with everyone. The question was how to do it, one, efficiently, and two, how to keep the test bank secure. And they weren't the kind of things we wanted completely in open access. And we have been regularly adding to them new versions of tests, updated visuals, and corrections. And you can see here on box.com, not Dropbox, Box, is how we've been doing this. And we have a folder for every unit that it contains all of the materials that teachers need to access to help them use the books. Bill?
And just to give you inside look of what one of these folders is, so we've made available to everybody all of the images that are included from the website. There are the unit tests, and then all of the individual documents that might go along with either the lesson plans that we've provided for the first 2 chapters, and then we also needed to figure out a system of these kind of 1.1, what text to attach them to, and labeling documents, and also then sharing answer keys. So that are the answer keys to both the homework and the classroom textbooks, that are really helpful for TAs and also for instructors like myself when you can't remember what the audio answers were for an activity. These are all the traditional ancillaries that a publisher would supply. And as being kind of OER authors, we all had to think about how to supply those. And you can see on this page that, we have about 267 people in here who are either owners or viewers and sharers of these materials.
And the other advantage of the box site for us has been that it's been very helpful for us to know who our users are. And from that list, we are able to send messages to our user teachers, some of whom are graduate students, some of whom are program directors or just instructors. Especially during the pandemic, which was when we held a webinar on using the book for remote learning, and also for getting additional feedback on how the book was and is being used at different institutions. We had a forum at our national AAT conference the first year that we used the book, and then we've had another one right before the pandemic started in February of 2020, and we got a lot of feedback from users at those, some of whom presented themselves and shared with us what they would like to see and what they were doing. And those were really helpful, I think, for everyone. The costs is one of the disadvantages of Box. It costs about $80 a month for hosting with that many users accessing it as viewers. But it has been offset by the small amount of royalties that we get for the printed classroom materials. Users do need an account, but it's free, and we manually add them, which one helps us know where the book is being used, but it does impose a little bit of a burden, but not one that we've been able to manage fairly easily. And Box, of course, is secure and has good versioning capabilities, so that we remain fairly secure that anything we put there remains there. Bill?
And I will just add one more thing to this slide. Knowing who your users are is really helpful for the feedback, but also if people are creating OERs at the pre-tenure level, being able to show a tenure and promotion committee exactly what extent of places are using your book and what quality of institutions are using your book and your materials is really helpful. And so that's been a plus for us. So then there's the question of where to author or maintain your OER. We were incredibly lucky in developing Mishdunami that this project came along and we were able to develop a strong partnership with the Academic Resource Center at the University of Kansas. The center provided the know-how and the labor to develop the site. And since ours was really such an extensive program, I don't think it would have been feasible for us to create this without that assistance. And it is important to say that although we had the support from the Resource Center, we didn't want to use all of the latest technological bells and whistles because we were afraid being on the cutting edge would also then leave us on the bloody edge. That there'd be a lot of things that would break regularly on the website. And so we chose an awful lot with John's encouragement, John Perkins' encouragement, to take a very conservative approach into how the site would work, really using the most basic of HTML coding. It's an incredibly stable site. We did have a small issue when a backhoe cut the main fiber optic cable for KU, and so we had to move the hosting onto a professional service that will add redundancy. But generally, the experience has been very good developing a website from scratch and then having these paper supports around it. Other folks, there are now alternative platforms for developing your OERs, Pressbooks, Top Hat, even folks working inside an LMS like Canvas to essentially create their whole course and then package it out and license it to people through something like Canvas Commons. If we were starting all over again, I don't know what we'd pick. I do like the freedom and the pedagogical flexibility that doing the website has given us. I find that Pressbooks, the few projects that I've looked at, strikes me as having a great linearity, right? That there's really a single flow through your materials. And our idea of that works as a cycle is very different from, I think, how a Pressbooks makes you think about how material unfolds. And once again, this was something that we walked into and was very rich for us and a great thing for developing a site with so much content. I think if you had a smaller project, or say you had just a module within your course that you wanted to create your own materials for, then I think a kind of Pressbooks might be really very helpful. And it does have a lot of capabilities with the H5P modules and activities added in.
Mhm. So the stability notwithstanding, we still had to figure out things like how we were going to keep the material updated, refresh things, and since everything is electronic on the, at least on the website, we were greatly gratified to realize that typos could be corrected instantly, and or nearly instantly. We did have to make a decision about the workbooks, and what evolved was that we would do an update once a year. So the workbooks had changing print versions once a year, and then we did a bigger update in 2020 with a new set of ISBNs. Um, so that is it seemed to work okay, and we managed to get that into that cycle. Then the pandemic came. Um, but the prospective users seem happy that we have a quite thorough set of materials, particularly if you're on a 4-4 load. You don't have a lot of time to be making up classroom activities and thinking about, which homework activities might work for what. And this includes both. We also have answer keys, which is very helpful again for, say, a non-native speaking TA who's in the classroom for the first time. Um, we've also had requests to use the book just as a grammar driller without the input, for example. And that kind of a little bit makes us squirm because one of the the rationale for us writing the book was to have a very input rich experience that would, through structuring that input, guide the student to being as immersed in communicating with the language as possible. We've also had requests, can we print out the website? And that was another place where we usually try to work with people in who write to us and ask that, and we try to ask them what they want to print out the website for, and try to get them to see how to work with the book without printing out the whole website. Um, but the ability to have our users fill out questionnaires, attend webinars, and forum sessions has been helpful in letting us know what kinds of additional support were needed, and then also what instructors really valued, and finally how students respond to the materials. Um, and we get questions all the time from new prospective adopters saying, "Is this going to go away? Is this going to vanish?" And we are very glad that we took the steps to make sure that it has not done that, and it does not do that. And we're able to answer, no, this is very stable. It is here. Um, Leaving aside the question of current realities, which make it a bit daunting to contemplate a world in which students go to Russia, given what is happening right the last 2 weeks. Between 2013, when we started piloting, and 2020, many of the cultural or small c aspects of the book changed in Russia. And that includes things like ordering taxis, which at the time you did by telephoning a taxi company, and now you do, of course, from your cell phone. What cities are located in what country? Because the minute we started piloting the book, there was the 2014 invasion of eastern Ukraine and of Crimea, and Yalta went from being in one country to being claimed to be in another country, and we had activities that actually had to be changed. Um, we Mobile phones, Instagram, WhatsApp, Telegram, all these apps really came to the fore after we started, and got used by Russians in different ways after we started piloting the book. So we'll be looking in our coming second edition at updating everything from the way that the Russians in the book use technology to everyday practices like how you order food for delivery, for example, getting around in the age of Uber, and Yandex Taxi, and even the question of whether perhaps we might want one of our students to be based and studying Russian not in the Russian Federation, but in a former Soviet republic where the teaching of Russian as a foreign language is highly developed, and where, for example, students from the United States Russian flagship programs routinely study abroad rather than in the Russian Federation.
And then this brings us to the last slide about refreshing our OER and the question of licensing and expanding notions of fair use and what to include. We ourselves as authors, because when we released Между нами, we were really trying to move people away from grammar instruction focus, right, which is still incredibly popular in Russian textbooks, of using grammar to drive the whole curriculum. We wanted to move to using the input to drive the curriculum. And we didn't necessarily want users to be able to just suck up the grammar sections and ignore the language input. So we licensed Между нами with a very restrictive license to try to avoid those kinds of things. Clearly, we're not going to sue people if they take the book and use it in a way that, you know, we don't particularly think is pedagogically sound. But I still struggle with how much control to give up. There's also, and I recognize in the world of OERs, there's this idea of kind of really allowing free recombinations and kind of reusing things. And I recognize that and I understand it. And yet in the realm of a first-year language textbook, there's always going to be an arc, right? Those chapters are not switchable, right? You can't start with chapter 8 because people won't know the alphabet yet, right? You can't move around chunks in quite that same way. So we'll definitely move to something that's perhaps a less restrictive license. But I don't really know how much that's going to help folks. I think at the intermediate level, right, a really very modular textbook might be much better, right? There might be some call for that. There is also the desire to incorporate more things, realia, more video, more visual content, more texts from Russian sources right into our book, kind of with those extended thoughts of fair use. And we're trying to figure out that, and then perhaps how to save some of those texts so that should they disappear from the internet, we'll still be able to use them. And I say that, and people might think that that's a wild exaggeration, right? YouTube isn't going to disappear. And yet the Russian Federation currently is having an enormous crackdown on technology projects. Facebook and Twitter, for example, have now been banned in the Russian Federation within the past 48 hours. YouTube could go very quickly. And that would be an enormous loss for all of us. And so thinking about how in the age of propaganda and also the age of internet censorship and that has come to Russia, how to really preserve these things is a real question. And I guess we should stop there so that folks have 4 minutes for questions and comments.
I don't know if you can see the chat window. There's already a
Yep.
question, which I think Lynn is looking at right now.
Yes, yes. Christian Hilche's question. So when we no longer do we have plans for when we no longer wish to maintain the textbook? Well, we're just starting now to plan out the second edition of the textbook, so we're going to be invested in it for a while, and we quickly realized after we'd started working on the book that this is a kind of like a marriage, and we're in it for a long while. The license at the moment, as I said, as Bill said, was a function of how we were thinking about it when we worked on the first edition, and we will likely move to a less restrictive license. I don't know that we've thought far enough ahead yet to the point where we are thinking about severing our work on the book entirely. We're years away from retirement, both of us, and so I think it's safe to say that the first edition of the book has really been 10 years from inception to now, and we're thinking about another similar kind of period. What happens after that, I don't know, but assuming the internet is still out there, the book will be. Bill, do you want to add anything there?
No, just wanting to say that yes, we're still involved for the next while. Got at least 7 years to go to retirement, so not that I've been counting. So yes, no, we'll keep on supporting it. The real question will come is when there's this moment of really needing to fundamentally rethink the experience that students have when they study abroad in Russia and or in other Russian-speaking places, and that's a real question mark. And when I feel that I can no longer do that in a culturally responsive way, that's the moment for me to pass the torch on to somebody else.
I'm going to quickly answer the question that was just asked. For me, this counted as scholarship. For Bill,
Yes, this also counted for scholarship for me because I started this project when I was still at the University of Kansas as the Russian language coordinator. And so part of my contract was developing textbooks and materials.
I think you have one other question.
Let's see. Oh, Emily. How did the process go with? Well, we started writing the we wrote a table of contents first, and we had vague ideas about what the plot of the story might be, but we didn't have the whole plot of it. And then sometime in June of 2012, I sat down and wrote, "This is Amanda Lee." And then it took off from there. But we knew basically what the episodes were going to contain. There was a New Year's Eve dinner during the first year when we had to sit and think about how the storyline was going to end, and that it's never a good idea to make pedagogical decisions over like wine. But how is the story going to end? Because we were writing the rest of the soap opera while we were finishing up. As we were using the book and piloting it. So it was this crazy year, 2013 to 2014. And then at that point, we were able to step back, take stock, and move some things around and see how they fitted and things like that.
And
All right.
oh,
Go ahead,
Yeah,
go
we
ahead,
think
Bill.
we're done.
and sometimes when writing the input, we realized that there was an awful lot of a certain kind of form or structure that was appearing. And that's when we decided to move things earlier, right? Or at least here's a little lexical block of, so the imperatives get first kind of introduced that there are these, and there are about 10 of them, but we don't talk about how the formation works until much later. So following the input really helped us.
All right. Thank you guys very much. We'll have to
Thanks,
cut
John.
you off here again. Contact information is available in the program if you guys have additional questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you.